But speaking of rights and interesting things happening in the political arena, the 2000 Mules movie triggered a wide range of responses, including from a range of conservatives like Ben Shapiro, who continue, I think, to misunderstand election law in America. And election law does not require for a vote to be the three parameters that I put out all the way back at the beginning is for it to be a constitutionally qualified election means that it must be done according to the rules set solely by the legislature of the state in the presidential context, unlike the Senate and other contexts. In the presidential context, explicitly, solely, exclusively, the state legislature, as the U.S. Constitution dictates. They determine the rules by which the president is elected. So for it to be a constitutionally qualified election, it means only the people the state legislature authorized to vote can vote. It means the method by which they cast a ballot must be by a constitutionally qualified manner, which is the rules set by the state legislature. And the way the vote is counted and canvassed must be consistent to the rules of the state legislature to be constitutionally qualified. So only constitutionally qualified voters cast a ballot. They cast a ballot in a constitutionally qualified manner, and it's counted and canvassed in a constitutionally qualified manner. It does not matter whether or not what someone's intent was anywhere in that process. If someone was ballot trafficking completely innocently, doesn't matter. Ballot doesn't count. If somebody thought they were qualified to vote and turns out they weren't, doesn't matter. Ballot doesn't count. If the ballot was canvassed or counted in a manner that was contrary to the rules, like outside of chain of custody, outside of observation, outside of proper documentation, ballot doesn't count. Doesn't matter whether they intended to do anything wrong ever. You don't have to prove fraud. You don't have to prove it would have been a legal vote if they would have done it differently, or their intent. All you have to prove is that ballot was not cast, counted, canvassed, or was by a person who was constitutionally qualified. That's what Dinesh D'Souza's 2000 Mules raises a serious question about the election in key swing states because people were placing ballots, he calls them mules, putting ballots in drop boxes when they appear to not be someone authorized to do so under the rules set by the state legislature. And thus those ballots are invalid if they were not cast. In other words, the chain of custody was broken in an impermissible manner. So a third-party person harvested a ballot he wasn't legally qualified to harvest. In that instance, that ballot doesn't count, period. Now, people get confused on the remedy. The remedy isn't that you assume every one of those ballots is a Biden ballot and thereby assume Trump is the winner. Under the presidential system, you have three potential remedies. You could have a recount, a revote. That's the normal remedy in non-presidential elections, a revote of that election in that state or that jurisdiction. The second thing, my belief was that the remedy was always to Congress. And there's two ways Congress could resolve it. Congress could disqualify the electors. I believe the vice president had that power because vice president exercised in the past, not necessarily that he should, but that he constitutionally had that power, as John Adams and others. They qualified votes, but they exercised power over qualification in so doing, both in 1796 and 1800. And you can find those videos at vivabarneslaw.locals.com at the time, contemporaneous to the incident and the issue. Or you could, what the 25th Amendment does, it says if we have a dispute in this context, and what the other parts of the Constitution also provide for, is that you vote by state delegation in the House of Representatives. And what I had told the President Trump, was that is the remedy that people should be focused on. I don't think courts have a role in this process, other than to make sure that happens. Because what we said is, you know what, the state should decide the presidency in the case of a contested election. Determine it's a contested election because there's more votes in doubt than the margin of victory. That's the legal standard. That's it. More votes in doubt. Don't have to prove illegal intent. Don't have to prove that voter was an illegal voter. All you got to do is that some aspect that was either counted, canvassed, cast, or by someone that was not constitutionally qualified in order to put that ballot aside. And if that you aggregate them more than the margin of victory, goes to the House of Representatives and they vote by state delegation. Now you can guess why Democrats never talked about that proposal. One, they didn't want meaningful investigation and inquiry about the questionable processes and procedures by which the election fornication took place in 2020. And second, if that had gone to state delegation, if you counted up who was a majority within those state delegations, Donald Trump would have been considered the elected winner of 2020 by the House of Representatives, given the political profile of those delegations. That's why it never reached that stage. Now, part of the reason it also didn't is because people got derailed by the Dominion story, which Dinesh D'Souza wisely said that was not a productive path to pursue. And as some people have mistakenly believed, there's this meme going around that the Dominion suits against various people have been dismissed. No, they have not. Just the opposite. More suits this week by Dominion. The motions to dismiss were denied, and all of them, as far as I'm aware, or almost all of them, are going forward against everybody into the discovery stage as to what's happening, because the Dominion path was a bit of a patsy path, as it turns out, in my view.
We'll get back to the Dominion in maybe like 2 minutes. But Robert, the question was this. People in attacking 2000 Mules or the methodology or whatever, they're saying, how do you know that these people were not bringing family member ballots? They were delivering ballots. Forget the fact that it was at 3:45 in the morning. Forget the fact that, at least in one video, we seem to see an argument between somebody putting the ballots in and somebody who's viewing this. How do you know that they don't just have extended family and are doing it for the neighborhood elderly who can't make it to the ballot box or the ballot drop off?
Well, I mean, the other thing is, why couldn't the elderly people deliver it to the post office or deliver it to the postman when they come to their door? Right? That's some of the reasons for suspicion are why are they using drop boxes at all? There were a lot of questions when they first introduced drop boxes. They're like, hold on a second. What does it really do? It interrupts the chain of custody from the person who cast the ballot to there by having by using all of these drop boxes. There's no recording of whether the person who filled out the ballot is the person who delivered it. Whereas that can be the case with the postal office. It was guaranteed not to be the case with the drop boxes. So that's problem one. Problem two is in many of these states, this was the Project Veritas issue with Minnesota. You couldn't do this many number of ballots. So some of these people clearly have more than sometimes those two, sometimes those three. And in some of these jurisdictions, you couldn't do it, period. There was no third party delivery allowed legally. There were some places there were witness requirements that clearly couldn't have been met. So those are the reasons why. And I would say 2000 Mules raises reasonable evidentiary inferences that justify further inquiry and investigation. The most effective way, we have one measurement that's better than any other for whether or not a ballot is a valid vote. And again, you don't have to prove intent to say it's an invalid vote or an illegal vote. Matt Brainerd, Look Ahead America, Richard Barris, the People's Pundit, have also repeated and reiterated this point because they're involved in these kind of matters on a regular basis. So, and that's a signature match. If there had been a meaningful signature, the only meaningful signature match check that was court ordered that ever occurred during the entire election was in Arizona, and the Democrats' own expert found more ballots didn't match in just the sample they looked at than if you projected it out was 10 times the size of the margin of victory in Arizona. So what I told the president the very first call was, you will know whether they believe the election is on the up and up by whether or not they allow and authorize a signature match check, because that's the easiest way to figure out what this ballot is. That still wouldn't make, if they harvested, that still might make an invalid vote. But at a minimum, you would know whether the ballot itself was suspect by whether or not the signature matched the confidential voter file that typical people didn't have access to. But one reason you would use this mule process is to launder ballots whose signatures wouldn't match, because you're interrupting the chain of custody, and that's how you get it into the system. You get it from mass mailing coming to you in the first place, ballots all over the place. Then you get it laundered back into the system through the mules. And the key is no signature match check happening, and no signature match check happened in any of these swing states.
I'm going to bring this chat up, and I'm going to get to a bunch of others that I've starred, and we're going to come back to before the show's over. Martin says, and this is just a disagreement of fact. I'm not trying to, put Martin on blast. They haven't shown even a single person being near more than one box. With 4 million minutes of video, the cell data with no control is worth noting, but a lot of people are hearing what they want to hear, so I guess we're all happy. This is where I have a disagreement on fact here. And Robert, am I wrong, or are we just agreeing with each other? The threshold for filtering the data was individuals who were near 10 boxes in one day, and one of those 501c3 get out and vote entities. So is this...
He means that they don't have surveillance video of the drop boxes of those people at multiple locations.
Fine.
And that's because I don't know how much they're able to. There's a misunderstanding of cell phone data. Now, there's two things been fascinating. All these fact checks, suddenly the media says, this geo-trafficking of a geolocation of cell phone data is totally hopeless. It often is wrong by miles. And it's like, what? I've seen people convicted on geolocation data. That data is, and go back to look at what they said about January 6 people. They've been locating them all day. They arrested people, got arrest warrants based on that geolocation data. So this pretend geolocation data is not like it's the 1980s. It's not the 1980s. This geolocation data is extremely precise. Within a few feet is how precise it was. Now, what I don't know is whether the geolocation, whether they got identifying information. Typically, when you buy up these geolocation data, you can correspond it. You can correspond the same phone number to other geolocation data like the Antifa riots and BLM riots, et cetera. But you often are not given identifying information because that has a whole different legal connotation. So they aggregate this data, and at the NSA, this is what's called unmasking. They'll see a number, and they're tracking the number and certain information they pull, but before they know who that person is, they have to get an unmasking request to line up the number with the person. I'm not sure the data that they got, the True the Vote got actually identified every name with those numbers. They're able to say, look, we have an anomaly. We have a group of people, about 2,000 or so in these key swing states, that have unusual activity around drop boxes and places that were involved in get out the vote. That was very unusual. That was and that thus we can raise the inference that these people were mules, and we have some video footage of what looks like mule-like activity. That's what they have. I don't know if they have the evidentiary means to go past that, but that's where again, for everybody out there, if you really believe in the election, why was every election official and every Democratic Party advocate, especially Mark Elias and some others, terrified of a signature match check? That's the one question they've never been able to answer me from the very beginning.
And now I understand the individual saying they got all this data, they said it, but they only showed like 3 or 4 video clips in the documentary. And by the way, if that's the argument, I'll just push back with a little obvious retort. One of the elements of the documentary was that a lot of these Dropbox stations didn't have the required 24/7 surveillance that they were supposed to have. And so if the argument is, well, that's all the footage they came up with, so it must be bunk, I would maybe retort. I would retort by saying, if you take that for granted, then you also have to accept that a lot of these drop boxes did not have 24/7 surveillance, which is itself a big problem, and you can draw some negative inferences from. But now I understand the point. Okay, fine. So they had the geolocation data. It's not unmasked, and all they had was 5 video clips of suspicious behavior. Okay, we are all seeing what we want to see. I just think that it raises a number of sufficiently serious questions. Oh, here we go. The cell data is worthless if you don't produce a controlled data set from a non-election period that does not show similar movement, basic scientific methods. Love you guys, but Barnes is drinking the Kool-Aid on this one. Okay.
My understanding is they did do that. In other words, what they did is that their metrics was, let's look at the election, after the election, before the election. They looked at all 3 time periods, and they said, what would be unusual? Let's see if there is anything unusual that comes from the data. And unusual would be traveling in this pattern around all these drop boxes, being at these drop boxes, and being at these locations that were NGOs. And they put high metrics on it. In other words, 5 visits to an NGO, at least 10 visits to Dropbox, at least multiple times. And if you look at the map of some of these, this is where they probably could have done a little more graphic use. The map, but just some of the maps they showed, you have very unusual travel patterns. And my understanding is they did compare it to the rest and said it was an unusual travel pattern compared to the norm. I agree from an evidentiary perspective, there's a bunch of levels you would go here. To be frank, it would be extremely expensive. I mean, just looking at some video surveillance footage, you're talking about 24/7 video surveillance footage over multiple weeks in multiple locations, over 300 just in Georgia. So, I mean, if they had active, this is what I tried to tell you about January 6th. I was like, I'm willing to help strategically and tactically, but I cannot ethically take on a client who nowhere. It would take all of my time, and I would have to add 10 lawyers to do a competent job for a single January 6th defendant. Because the massive amount of discovery. That's what you have times 10 in the election context. That's why I always told people, look, cut through all of it. Just ask for a signature match check. Just give me a sample size. Just give me a reasonable sample size, and we'll rock and roll. Georgia Ratburger promised to do that, and then at the last minute pulled out. He only pulled out after Sidney Powell did her little Dominion speech, and he was like, bingo, we're out of trouble now. We can have everything focused on Dominion, and now the real glaring crime, every great crime needs a great patsy. And that's, I think, what happened. But and maybe this Friday I'll be on with, I won't be available in June, so I may do the Freeform Friday with Eric Hunley and Mark Robert, because Mark Robert has highlighted a general's role that's very interesting in the John Kennedy JFK assassination that I was even unaware of. I didn't realize certain tie-ins. But what did Lee Harvey Oswald keep saying? I'm a patsy, I'm a patsy, I'm a patsy. What I said from day one, Dominion's a patsy, Dominion's a patsy, Dominion's a patsy. It's meant to distract everybody, so the real crime would go uncaught. But I think what took place, what D'Souza has done is a very good evidentiary job. It can't be perfect. It can't be complete. There's limitations of resources to do either, but it raises us. This anomaly should not happen. This anomaly should not occur. You should not have this many people on videotape unloading a bunch of ballots in states where, for the most part, ballot harvesting was illegal. You should not have cell phone data that shows very unusual travel patterns of a large number of people. And it's grounds for further inquiry and investigation, but we'll see whether anybody has the guts and courage to do so.